América Latina es una de las regiones más desiguales del mundo. Esta alta desigualdad tiene raíces profundas que hacen que se transmita de generación en generación, implicando una baja movilidad intergeneracional. Este es un problema de primer orden, ya que las posibilidades de las personas para progresar respecto a sus padres no solo impactan en la equidad, sino también en el crecimiento, la cohesión social y la estabilidad político-institucional de los países. ¿Cuáles son las principales causas detrás de la baja movilidad intergeneracional en la región? CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, presenta el Reporte de Economía y Desarrollo 2022, Desigualdades heredadas. El rol de las habilidades, el empleo y la riqueza en las oportunidades de las nuevas generaciones. Documento que brinda un diagnóstico pormenorizado de la movilidad social en América Latina y el Caribe y profundiza sobre sus determinantes, mostrando la influencia de distintos condicionantes para formar habilidades, acceder a empleos de calidad o lograr acumular riqueza. Cómo el género, la etnia o el lugar de residencia y la exposición a riesgos, como los macroeconómicos o los asociados al cambio climático, pueden incidir en la movilidad intergeneracional de la población latinoamericana y caribeña. ¿Qué políticas se requieren para reducir el peso de las desigualdades heredadas y asegurar verdaderas oportunidades para las nuevas generaciones en la región? Reporte de Economía y Desarrollo 2022. CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina.
Muy buenos días para todos. Soy Nicolás Núñez y en nombre
Good
de
morning to everyone. I'm Nicolás Núñez on behalf of CAF Development Bank Latin America. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the regional presentation of the report on Economy and Development 2022 entitled Inherited Inequalities, the Role of Skills, Employment, and Wealth in the Opportunities of New Generation. This event is held here in Montevideo within the framework of the 176th meeting of the CAF board, held today, 5, and tomorrow, 6 December, here in Montevideo. We have with us very well-known speakers to analyze the problem of persistence in Latin America and Caribbean in terms of inequality, and also be able to discuss on policies tending to ensure the access to better opportunities for new generation. We would like to invite you to send your feedback on the social media through the hashtag RedCAF, and also follow us and interact there in our accounts at Agenda CAF in Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are broadcasting by streaming in Spanish, English, and Portuguese through our webpage, www.caf.com, and our YouTube channel. To begin the event, let us invite to Mr. Sergio Díaz Granados, Executive President of CAF, for the opening remarks. Welcome. Good morning. Let me especially greet the CAF team that has made this report possible, the president, the vice president, also the general secretary. Let me also greet Carlos Aramillo, the president of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also thank him for being here with his team. For us, it's really very important, CAF, to be able to keep communication, coordination, and joint work in our region. Also, let us especially greet the former minister and Senator Carlos Tominami coming from Chile. He also wrote a very interesting page in CAF, the return of Chile to CAF. Let me also thank you, Carlos, for your presence here. It's really very important for us now that we are on our way to materializing all of that aspiration in having to have Chile back again as full members. So thank you very much for your presence. And of course, to the technical teams who follow us online from several parts in Latin America and the Caribbean. For more than 15 years, CAF has been and continues to be a partner of countries. And of course, our greatest interest is not only the provision of financial resources, but also to contribute to the discussion in the region with products as the one that we are going to introduce today with knowledge products. CAF started, as you can see here in this slide, as a sub-regional bank, but today it already has 21 partner countries. Almost the whole region is represented in CAF, and we aspire in the next few years to continue that process with new incorporations and discoveries in new areas, particularly in the Caribbean. And the bank is approaching, thanks to the effort of all these years, to approvals around $14 billion. One of the main instruments, as we've been saying, of the bank is it's not only financial provision, but also reports on economy. And one of the main one is the report on economy and development that we launch every year. We've been doing so for almost 20 years now. And today's is on inherited inequalities. This is a particularly concern for the region, which is the distribution of inequality. And the launch is also done within a framework of having design in CAF an action strategy for the next few years with the objective of becoming a bank for social and economic renewal that is inclusive and sustainable, and that also helps mitigate the impact of climate change in the region. This is why the board in December last year, when approving the capitalization, they set this path of 40% of our approvals from now to 2026 need to make up a portfolio that includes adaptation and mitigation. So we are heading to doubling the size of the bank with this capitalization. Our board approved this capitalization, the largest one in history, in around $7 billion in March this year. Assembly is in Asunción, and we want to increase the relevance and the importance of the institution in order to face the old new challenges that we have, particularly to meet the SDGs. So the challenge is to grow strongly and do it in a sustainable manner and make that growth bring up more inclusion and be consistent with the inclusive growth and environmental sustainability. So the challenge today is focusing on this discussion. And those of you who are here are expert in this subject, that maybe for decades and centuries, one of the most unequal regions in Latin America, and it continues to be true despite the economic progress that has been made and the social challenges in the last 20 years, especially. But that has not been enough in order to um, destroy the unequal roots of our region. Figures indicate that a small portion of our population can retain the wealth of the region, and those disparities also reach educational and labor opportunities for Latin Americans and Caribbeans. The map also shows the darker colors, those that have higher values of inequality in terms of income, and our region is one of the most unequal ones in the planet. Apart from these levels of inequality, with certain reduction at the beginning of the century, but then it seems to have stagnated and is kept constant above levels of other regions in the world, at least in the last 3 or 4 decades, we've lost our capacity to reduce that inequality. That inequality figure is seen every day in the toughest ways that we can imagine. Millions of children and youth in the region that many times inhabit the most vulnerable areas like favelas, chaolas, settlements, and cantegrils, Casaballe, and shanty towns, or regions that seem remote due to the absence of infrastructure and the most fundamental services for life like water, sanitation, energy, education, etc. And we see how these figures are translated every day in Latin America. In the region, 161 million people, that is to say 2.5 out of 10, have no access to drinking water. Even more, 431 million people, 7 out of 10, have no access to sanitation. Waters are directly taken to seas or pipelines or the sea, and this also generates gender inequality. Water is not present wherever you live, and women and children, especially girls, have to go look for drinking water. In Peru, women um, work in the 80% of informal labor, and they have to go look for water that is essential for them, for everybody. Education is also a structural problem in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is also manifested in its access as well as inequality. The World Bank, in a recent report, argued that the region is going through an unprecedented educational crisis, and the poverty of education is defined as the percentage of children under 10 that have no capacity of reading and understanding a simple text, and this could have grown due to the effect of the pandemic from 61 to 72%. So we have 7.2 million girls and boys in primary education that have a chronic absence of education. Around 7% of 7 million, 75 million people have no access to fuel or technology to cook. And this is also exacerbated poverty and vulnerability after and during the pandemic. Last Friday, we've also presented the IDEA report on access to water and energy. We still have millions of families that are cooking with timber in Latin America and the Caribbean. The contamination is also associated to lung cancer and cardiovascular diseases that mainly affect women that have to take water but also have to cook with timber. And they are the ones that have to uh, 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 deal with different problems. They could spend even 6 hours traveling different paths in order to obtain fuel, in order to cook, and in order to generate food for their families. Hours that are really sacrificed in terms of education or looking for a job or for more productive employment. This is why in CAF we say that the energy transition cannot simply be a leap towards a vacuum. It needs to be equal and it needs to use the tools that our region has. Let me remind you that here at the board, in CAF in December last year, March this year, and July this year, and in March next year, we will approve operations aiming towards a more equal transition. For instance, and I see Minister Burneo here, we've approved last July an operation for the expansion of household gas in Lima that will give a source of energy to women, to households in Lima, Callao, in order to access a trustworthy, cleaner energy service than the timber consumption that they had a couple of months ago in the region. Social unrest, also as a result of all of this and many other factors, has widespread. Only 49% of the Latin American population supports democracy, and that support in 2013 was close to 70%. And there's important social unrest that weakens this contract between citizens and the government. Those inefficiencies added to public services is generating great pressure on institutions. Apart from that, we also have the topics on victimization. 1 out of 5 Latin American has been victim of robbery in the last year. One of the reasons of that violence is the growth of young population who does not work or go to schools. So 32 million people that have no education or work. Those youths are becoming victims of criminal activities. The expansion of drug trafficking throughout the whole region is also weakening the region's capacity in order to administer justice, keep security, and keep institutions safe. It will be very difficult for the region to reach the SDGs 16 objectives of justice with such a growth of drug trafficking that finds a region with more vulnerable after COVID and with 32 million young people with no hope at all. So in this study, we have an effort to collect data. This report documents all sorts of disparities at the geographical one, as you can see here in the map, that falls over a minority group in many countries. These are important figures of Afro-Latin populations or indigenous populations. We can say that it also makes an important dialogue of the weight of our region, the lottery of the cradle that also relates the well-being of the parents with the success of their children. For many Latin American and Caribbean populations, the possibility of getting good education, of getting to a university, have a long and quality life, have their dream of having their own house is strongly limited by the fact of having been born in a poor place. The diagnosis shows that social mobility is really very low. This represents a big problem for equality and from other aspects to grow in the region. For example, when the individual progress depends very much on the family route, this allocation of human talent is distorted, and it also undermines the many other things. This low mobility require strong action on the part of governments, banks, and everybody. The report also says that the lack of mobility is affected by many risks. These risks are not associated to macroeconomic crisis today or the danger of the technological danger in the displacements of value chains. It's also associated, as we've seen in the last few years, to specific weaknesses in order to face a pandemic, for example. And of course, even more so with sudden and quick migrations that in many cases are causing these economic destructions and also the risks generated by climate change. So what are the main results that are found in RED 2022, apart from reminding the high inequality and the high levels of social segregation, um, uh, to set the context of how we have reached this place? Also, this content includes lots of generations that have generated inequality. There's important challenge in education, lack of education, in access to some technical and professional education, of course, closing gaps within the quality educational offer. Certain groups are unable to get a social mobility, and for generations, they remain in the same planes. Afro-descendants, indigenous populations, those who in live in marginalized areas, and women in poor areas. And this results in several links that bind the well-being of parents and children. RED presents a menu of policies in order to um, do without those intergenerational inequality links. We need to break up with this vicious circle, and we should know that we cannot do it alone in order to strengthen all of these policies and also to take new risks. We all have to contribute in terms of consensus and agreements. Last year in our joint report done with the OECD, the European Commission, and ECLAC, we talked about the urgency of talking once again about social contract in Latin America and the need to generate some contracts that will not only move intergenerational agreements, but also urban and rural agreements that will allow us to give a sense of unity to our societies once again in order to move forward. Uh, we cannot apply the line of poverty to everybody the same way. We need to consider the characteristics and personal circumstances. And let me add also the circumstances of each of our countries and regions. In terms of CAF, the menu of policies proposed in red is perfectly in line with what we want to do with the bank, having 6 agendas. One specifically that of social well-being with equality, inclusion, and diversity. So let me also greet Pablo Bartola and Ana Maria Vallardi, our manager in social and gender departments, because this document is very important for them in order to illustrate the conversation that we need to have next year with governments, with the private sector, and some other institutions. And that agenda for social well-being with equality, inclusion, and diversity is added to the ones that we've already been working on in terms of resilience, sustainability, greater levels of productivity, protection of our environmental services, and a fair and responsible transition in terms of energy. Of all the strategic agendas that CAF wants to provide, for sustainable growth, for this lottery of the cradle, as we call it, so that it's not something that continues to strengthen the links of inequality in the region. Let me finish with this reflection of Eduardo Galeano with this book, El Fútbol a Sol y Sombra. It reminds us how the story of this sport is a sad uh, journey from for this. In the past few decades, Afros were not included. Some teams were even disqualified because they had Black people. Today, nobody questions that. Nobody even cares about the sexual preference of a player or the color of his skin or where he was born. We just celebrate our shirt. We need the rest of society and economy move towards the same direction. And this is what we want to add with this reflection. So we need to start identifying what it is that limits us, what is it that prevents us from recognizing that we have almost 400 million people that have no access to basic sanitation services and make a crusade for them. Thank you very much for being with us in the launch of this report. I wish the greatest success to all the panelists to help us think what else we need to do from the Development Bank in order to materialize all of this. Thank you very much.
Le agradecemos al presidente por estas.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your kind words. And now we are going to give the floor to the presentation of the report on Economy and Development 2022, Inherited Inequalities, the role of skills, employment, and wealth in the creation of new opportunities for new generations. We have prepared a video that illustrates some of the topics presented on the report. We are going to watch it now.
Tengo 23 años, soy de Cochabamba, Bolivia, soy mamá y estudiante de fisioterapia. Empecé en bicicross a los 6 años por la influencia de mis dos hermanos mayores. Empecé a competir, a viajar a nivel nacional de todo Bolivia, empecé a competir en los certámenes internacionales en representación de mi país, Bolivia. Una experiencia y recorrido de 15 años. Tenía un legado de mi papá que trataba de mantener y superarlo. Él era uno de los mejores pilotos del país. El 2016 aparecieron unas becas a 3 varones, 3 mujeres de todo Bolivia para hacer un curso de alto rendimiento en China. Entonces, como yo era la campeona nacional, me correspondía a mí un espacio de la beca, pero obviamente por motivos muy personales, que iban muchos hombres y yo era mujer, no tenía ningún familiar y era muy niña todavía. Lastimosamente me vi vulnerable y tuve que rechazar esa beca. Entonces, obviamente para mí todo eso ha sido decepcionante, una depresión de aquellas, porque esforzarme tantos años para un solo objetivo y no lograrlo, entonces era una decepción total. Con mis hijos va a ser totalmente diferente. Si ellos tienen la oportunidad, voy a hacer que ellos aprovechen.
Mi nombre es Wilkinson Arrieta, soy del Consejo de Estado de Aragua, Venezuela. Fui criado por mis abuelos. Mis padres fueron padres muy jóvenes. Me tuvieron entre los 15 y 16 años. Mi papá era el líder de una banda delictiva. En principio fue algo muy rudo para mí porque solía ver cosas que un niño no debería ver. Vivía en un barrio un poco peligroso donde casi que todos los días o todos los fines de semana se escuchaban enfrentamientos entre bandas. La transformación de mi padre influyó mucho en mí cuando empezó el proyecto Alcatraz. Fue una fase para él donde duró 3 meses en una montaña, aislado de todo, de la sociedad, él y sus amigos. Al regresar prácticamente que era otra persona, no se le veía odio, rencor o todas esas cosas que una persona que está en ese mundo tiene en su mirada. Me enamoré de este deporte porque digamos que me enseñó a vivir la vida y a saber que, bueno, que las cosas buenas que uno quiere en la vida siempre requieren un sobreesfuerzo de nuestra parte. Creo que mi vida sin tener una otra oportunidad o sin el rugby hubiese sido bastante turbia. Siempre hay opción. siempre hay opción y aunque la vida nos rete o cada vez se ponga más difícil, sé que al final depende de nosotros salir adelante.
Mi nombre es Elisa Correa, tengo 25 años, soy abogada residida de la Universidad de Itela. Nací en Campana, en un barrio popular que se llama Las Campanas. Mi familia en ese momento estaba conformada por mi mamá, que es ama de casa, y mi viejo, que en ese momento era policía. Y éramos varios hermanos en total, somos 6. En mi infancia fui a una escuela de un barrio, más o menos a los 10, dentro de la escuela me ofrecieron postularme para una beca para irme a un colegio privado que estaba en Campana también. Y hice todo el secundario en ese colegio siendo casi la única que venía de un barrio popular. Cuando terminé el secundario, como me había ido bien, me contactaron con la Universidad de Itela para postularme nuevamente a otra beca. En Itela me dieron una beca del 100%, por lo cual yo pude estudiar ahí, porque la verdad era como algo que estaba muy lejos de mis posibilidades socioeconómicas, de mi familia, poder acceder a ese tipo de educación de élite. Hoy siento que estoy parada en el lugar donde quería estar. Estar hoy trabajando en el Instituto de la Vivienda, que forma parte del Ministerio de Desarrollo Social y Hábitat de la ciudad. Siento que cuando estoy ayudando a otros también estoy ayudando a mi gente, y eso es algo que muy poca gente lo va a entender si no naciste en estos lugares. Yo creo que es importante para impulsar cambios sociales en América Latina y el Caribe darle voz a otra gente, y eso también significa darle voz a las mujeres que venimos de sectores populares.
Bien, para presentar el reporte vamos a invitar al escenario a Lucila Berniel y Dolores de la
To
Mata.
introduce the report, I would like to invite onto the stage the chief economist of CAF, Lucila Bernier, holds a PhD of economy from the Carlos III University of Spain and a master's from the same university. She holds a degree in economy from the University of Córdoba. She is also a partner from CEPE, Torcuato Di Tella University from Argentina, and she was also researcher at the EDR Foundation. She also worked as a professor at the Carlos III University of Spain, Torcuato Di Tella Universities, and National Universities of La Plata and Córdoba. And Dolores de la Mata also holds a PhD in economics and master's in economics at the Carlos III University of Spain. She holds a degree in economics from the National University of Córdoba, Argentina. She worked as professor of this major at the University of Rosario, Colombia, professor at the Carlos III University of Spain and National University of Córdoba. She was also researcher at IERAL of the Mediterranean Foundation of Argentina. Thank you. Thank you very much to all participants for being present here. It is a pleasure for us to be here presenting our report 2022 on inherited inequalities. This is a report that we identify with. We live in such an unequal region. Now, if we order Latin Americans according to their income level, we can see the following figures according to the latest reports. 50%, the poorest 50% of the population only participates in 10% of the total income. And if we move to wealth, the poorest 50% only participates in 1%, whereas the richest percent of the population takes 77% of wealth and 55% of income, respectively. So this is the picture of inequality. If we take a look at the dynamics of inequality in the last years, we see here, according to the Gini index of the region, some ups and downs. So we can identify some concrete periods, an increase of inequality in the 90s, for example, a decline of inequality steadily in the 2000s and some stagnation periods in the 80s. And in the past years, actually before the pandemic started, we were going through a stagnation period in inequality levels. Now, despite these ups and downs, the region has always been very unequal. And if we compare ourselves to other regions in the world, in these other inequality indicators, we see that throughout the past 3 decades, Latin America has always had a higher inequality level compared to other regions. And this speaks of the profound roots that cause inequality is be moved from generation to generation. So an example that we can see that inequality goes from parents to children. This is data for 22 countries in many cities, and we see the education level. So these were parents in the 80s in particular. So in that group, half of the people have a medium to high education level, secondary school and above. Now in the 80s, we see that on average, educational levels improved. Two-thirds have medium or high education levels. But it's interesting because when we combine parents and children data, the family characteristics condition the educational possibilities of children. So in particular, we see here that around 90% of children from parents with medium and high education also have the same education level. And if we consider the children who completed low education levels, we see that 81% of them come from households where parents also had low education levels. Now, the other side of the coin here is the low intergenerational mobility, and this is the central issue of the report. It is very important to understand the reasons behind this intergenerational mobility and how the well-being from parents to children is related. So we see that countries with the highest levels of intergenerational mobilities offer their citizens higher income and advancement opportunities. And this, of course, favors equality and also promotes a better allocation of human talent, allocation of resources, promoting equity and growth, and a higher social cohesion and institutional and political stability. So these are three main pillars to aspire for sustainable development. The report also offers a detailed diagnosis on intergenerational mobility in Latin America, and we focus mainly on answering two types of questions which are very important in the discussion of social mobility and inequality. And the first question is related to whether children are better off than their parents. And for that, we used measures that calculate this percentage in different levels of well-being, for instance, education, healthcare, occupation, income, and wealth. And so this is what we call absolute mobility. And as you can see on this chart, if children are at the same education level an occupation and income level as their parents, we would have zero mobility in this example. So the contrary would be what we see on the slide, where all children go up one step compared to their parents. This would be 100% absolute mobility. The other question that we want to answer is related to how related the well-being level is between parents and children. And high relationship levels would tell us that the household conditions would affect the progress of children. And these measures are very good for us to see whether the advantaged or disadvantaged families are always the same or if there is some sort of reordering among generations. So a greater relationship would be higher relative mobility, and a lower relationship would mean a higher relative mobility. An important part of the diagnosis of the report is based on educational mobility measures. There are many sources that allow us to make these estimates. And also, the report resorts to census data, so we can have a longer term perspective following generations even born at the beginning of last century. So in terms of education, you can see the percentage of people who did not complete primary school at the beginning of last century to the most recent cohorts, going from 88% of people, 90% of people who did not complete primary education to less than 5% at present. So basically, this was promoted by the universalization of primary education in the region. Now, in terms of secondary education and university, progress was more moderate. You can see this on dark green, the percentage of people who complete primary education. And among the youngest cohorts, 1/3 of the people completed primary education. In the dark bars, we see the percentage of people who completed secondary school. This accounts for 40% of young generations, and only 19% of the younger generations complete university studies in our region. So this increase in education coverage allowed many young people to go beyond their parents' education level. So you can see here on the right the measures of absolute mobility. In the case of education, we see that in Latin America, 6 out of 10 children manage to exceed the education level of their parents. So this is well below less developed regions. However, when we take a look at this relationship or association in terms of the years of education between parents and children, Latin America is still among the least mobile regions. This is because of the fact that the most developed regions, their children reach higher education levels, whereas the children of least educated parents reach less education levels. So this is a chart for you to see how for the different cohorts things went like. And so in the first line, throughout time, you can see the probability of completing primary school when parents didn't complete. And so these values are high over time. For someone born in the 80s, the chances of completing primary school was 63% in the region. Now, if we go higher and we take a look at the chances of completing secondary school, the values go down. And once again, those born in the 80s show a variability of 36%. If we go higher and we take a look at the probability of completing university studies when parents hadn't completed it, values are lower. For someone born in the 80s, those chances are 12%. 1 out of 10 children of non-university parents would complete university studies. And you can take a look at this line on the right and how it contrasts strongly with what happens among children of more educated parents who completed secondary school and university at a higher level, 4 times as high. And the gaps, as you can see, increase over time. And this is also very important. What I show you so far are just is an average for the region, but we can make a detailed analysis taking into account the differences in the countries in order to identify the disadvantaged populations. And we see certain ethnic groups, Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples are at a disadvantaged position. So in Ecuador, we should see equality in terms of mobility possibilities but we will see low values when there is a lag. So in primary level, there are no big gaps, but these gaps increase when we take a look at the possibilities in secondary school education and university education. So we see that every 10 white people who complete university when the parents hadn't, we have only 4 Afro descendants and 3 indigenous peoples. So this expands the gaps in education differences among these ethnic groups. Another point to analyze on the report, which is something that calls our attention, is to show the wide difference and diversity of mobility possibilities in each country, within the country. So this is Peru. We can see in dark colors that the levels of mobility are lower compared to regions where the colors are lighter. So this shows that even within countries, realities are more distant than among countries. And on the report, we also express that districts and regions with a higher population show, on average, higher chances of absolute education mobility. And in other countries, we show that the persistence in terms of mobility probabilities have remained very strong in the past 40, 50 years. And finally, we analyze gender issues. And once again, you can see the dots, if they were closer to 1, the possibilities for mobility for men and women would be similar. And in the cohorts from last century, women were in advantage versus men. However, they were in disadvantage in terms of education. And throughout time, these gaps have reversed, and women now present higher education mobility than men. And so this result is consistent with this great economic expansion that favored women. However, it contrasts the progress possibility for women in other well-being dimensions. And this shows that education mobility is a necessary condition for social progress, and there are other values or other barriers that can limit this social progress.
In fact, as Dolores was saying, you would expect that any educational progress be transformed into an occupational or working progress. But when we analyze occupational mobility, we find some figures that have an impact and show also that a big percentage of children still continue where their parents' occupation. A 30% share their occupational category with their parents, and this figure, it ranks among the highest in the world. In order to understand absolute mobility in occupational terms, we compare those occupations in terms of the complexity of the tasks characterizing the occupations, being highly complicated ones, those that give higher wages, risk for technological automation. And in the region, not everyone can access these highly complex occupations. For children to parents with low complexity occupations, that probability of accessing this type of occupations is only 11%, while for children of parents with highly complex occupations, the probability is almost 6 times higher. And this figure places the region again among the most immobile ones in terms of occupation in the world, with a persistence in time also, because the figures indicate that in the last estimates done, it shows that in the last 50 years, occupational mobility has not improved in the region. That is to say, today we have children that exceed their parents in some educational levels, but they are so low that they are not enough in order to make an occupational leap that, of course, the modern economy is requiring. And the combination of the educational persistence and the occupational persistence determines high levels of persistence in terms of income. The region, again, according to the metric of income persistence, ranks among the most immobile ones in the world, well above very developed economies, but also well above very poor economies, like the case of sub-Saharan Africa. In the report, we also try to analyze beyond education and income. We want to understand the persistent terms of health and wealth, but for this well-being dimensions, data are quite scarce. So we try to collect individual information through our CAF survey that is done in 10,000 households in 10 large cities in 10 countries in the world, in the region. And in that case, we obtained comparable metrics of persistence in these four dimensions of well-being. We are interested in knowing which of them shows greatest level of persistence. So we measure in income, in quality of household, education, and health. And the estimates indicate that persistence in education is high, and the values that I show here are comparable. We can organize these dimensions of well-being and see where we find the greater level of persistence. We see that this is how it's classified. Health seems to be the lowest persistence, followed by education, and then this quality in household and income. And this lower persistence in health is consistent with another piece of information shown also in the report, saying that the association between health of mother and the health of young children has come down in the region, and that's good news in the region to disassociate early health from the mother's uh, health conditions, and this lower persistence in maternal childhood health has to do with a greater expansion in the coverage and also the generalization of certain practices and health technologies that have been experienced by the region in the last few decades. So with the CAF report or survey, we were also done something really good, which is trying to understand the intergenerational persistence, not only between parents and children, but going beyond in time to see the roots of that persistence. And we're able to link the educational achievement of children with their parents, with their grandparents, and with their great-grandparents. So we found a strong multi-generational persistence shown in these figures. The probability of access into university is of around 26 percentage points more for children of university parents, representing an increase of 200% in the chances of accessing university level for the children to university parents vis-a-vis non-university parents. Those figures continue to increase when we go further above this tree with those great parents who were able to access university. So the group of determinant factors within all of this multi-generational mobility is quite complex. What we do in this report is try to classify the discussion to understand mechanisms and then propose policies that try to break up with those intergenerational links. So we try to classify the discussion in a life cycle scheme with three types of channels for transmission of inequalities operating with different weight in different cycles of life. The first channel has to do with accumulation of human capital, very important from the time of conception to the first decades of life. Then we have the channel of labor opportunities that begins to gain strength from the first adulthood to pension. And the third one is for accumulation of wealth that also matches in time with terms of in terms of labor opportunity. So in the book, we have for each of these channels a whole chapter devoted to discussing different type of mechanisms and policies. In the case of human capital, we propose three groups of mechanisms. The first one has to do with restrictions to invest in human capital of children. These are quite strong for more disadvantaged families. These are not typical restrictions that we generally see that have to do with the financial aspect, but we also document the importance of some other type of barriers, like, for example, the informative and cognitive behavioral ones, and also restrictions for insurance to in terms of parents towards their children. Of course, this is differential for different times of life. We highlight two important periods, critical periods. One that has to do with conception and first childhood, and then the other one at adolescence and transition to adulthood. We know that lack of insurance has a strong impact in mobility of those children that were born or had their early stage in life, and the effect of climate shocks or macroeconomic shocks that imply the loss of income for the parents. Another second group of mechanisms is also related to restricted elections, in this case, elections that have to do with education and residence. In this case, we document something that is very well known in the region that has to do with the gaps of socioeconomic equality that exist, but we also show high and growing levels of school segregation that are being observed, particularly in some countries. In the case of technical and higher education, we show the importance of funding gaps, but also some other gaps like information gaps. And we also show the importance of supply gaps, the spatial differences in supplying this type of education. Last, in terms of elections that require restriction in terms of residence, we show the importance of the physical and social environment in order to promote mobility. And we observe that at least when comparing the possibilities of mobility between micro-regions in the region, we observe that educational inequalities are explained in one-fourth due to disparities of the environments to which young people and children are exposed to. And this can increase when considering the differences in exposure to peers and to socio-environmental factors within cities. These two type of mechanisms worsen with the presence of patterns of family conformation in the region. The teenage pregnant rate is still very high. The young maternity rate is very high, is persistently high for some countries. Very few countries are able to reduce the burden of this problem. And also teenage pregnancy is a characteristic that is transmitted into generations per se. We see that the transmission of young maternity is quite strong in the region from mothers to daughters. And this indicates that many are households are single parent households with all the problems in the restrictions in order to invest in children. And we also add a third factor that has a lot to do with social segregation observed in the region, the fact that coupling is quite selective, the different human capital people are coupled among themselves, determining that their raising environment is quite different for high human capital couples vis-a-vis low human capital couples. According to the diagnosis, we have three types of policy recommendations. The first have to do with alleviating all sorts of restrictions that were just mentioned, not only financial ones, but also information and cognitive behavioral ones, and also what has to do with risk management and insurance. The second type of policies aims at improvements in the supply, both coverage, quality, and pertinence, or relevance in all educational levels, and also especially focusing on closing spatial, territorial, or regional gaps. In the last item here, we grouped all policies that try to improve the habitat where the children's and adolescents' life is experienced, especially for smaller children, and also policies that try to improve accessibility to basic equipment for the development of human capital. This is also a link to the working capital. All of these recommendations in terms of policies has also other type of recommendations in terms of approach, and many of these focus on closing spatial gaps, closing ethnic and racial gaps, and also closing gender gaps. Everything that we've learned from human capital formation is immediately related to human capital and what it can offer in labor markets, how you can sell that in the labor market. And this is where we come with labor opportunities. When comparing people of similar human capital, we see that the performance may change a lot depending on the family of origin. This influence of families in their working performance is explained, or rather we propose this way of thinking through four types of mechanisms. The first one have to do with information, with contact networks, recommendations. We quantitatively show through the CAF survey and other sources of information the importance of family in job search, in recommendations, in the entry to the world of labors with quality jobs. Second, referred to occupational persistence, has to do with a different type of persistence, which is the residential one. We show with our CAF survey that around 45% of Latin Americans in large cities reside in the same neighborhood where their parents resided, and almost one-third of them also live in the same house as their parents. This in a world where we know that there are large gaps of productivity and working opportunities within the cities and among cities, added to spatial frictions associated to problems in transport. What happens is that children and parents end up exposed to very similar job opportunities, which is fundamental mechanisms to explain occupational persistence. A third group of mechanisms has to do again with insurance in view of shocks. The labor market is generally affected by macroeconomic shocks, but also increasingly more by technological shocks. And the most unfavorable families are more exposed to this type of risk and also have less protection due to the incidence of informality, which is much higher among low socioeconomic level workers. And we see that macroeconomic shocks have a higher impact on young people of the unfavorable families and leave scars that are observed in long term. After many decades, you continue to see the consequences, these scars of having been an unfavorable young person exposed to bad macroeconomic conditions within the labor market when accessing that labor market for the first time. And last, families also convey some other attributes, as for instance, ethnic racial characteristics that are quite punished in labor markets in the region. In fact, we show that discrimination plus some other aspects associated to spatial segregation highly explain the persistence in inequalities that are being suffered by certain groups, as for instance, Afro-descendants and indigenous populations descendants. In terms of policies, once again, we have from this diagnosis, 5 groups of policies. The one that has to do with the continuous labor training to close different gaps. Also, employment and intermediation services that are key in order to close the asymmetries in information and approach information in terms of opportunities to all the youth. What has to do with the reduction in productivity and spatial opportunities gaps. Here we have at least 3 groups of policies, those that have to do with transportation, with the design of household policies that should contemplate the accessibility to productive centers, and those that have to do with the provision of basic equipment that is needed by certain regions in order to try to exploit their productive potential. We're not talking about closing spatial gaps in productivity, but we are trying to give these regions basic opportunities so that each of them can make the most of their potential and there can be quality vacancies for residents in the different companies. Fourth, we have the anti-discrimination policies. In this case, we, of course, have the affirmative policies, but we propose some that also go to other educational environments and cultural environments to generate social change that we need so that discrimination no longer is a commonality within our labor markets. And last, we have the pack of policies that have to do with social protection and some other labor regulations that tries to mitigate the risks associated to recessions and technological changes. In terms of wealth accumulation, we propose 4 types of channels. The first and most important one has to do with inheritance. We show that inheritance in the region explain great part of the intergenerational persistence of wealth. For instance, it explains between 25 and 50% of this persistence according to the type of assets. In fact, if we compared people, or when we compare people that have similar educational levels that are behaved in a similar way in the labor market, even so, for coming from different family origins, they accumulate different types of wealth. So the main concern in the chapter is to understand the role of these inheritance mechanisms, the transfer of financial knowledge that will imply problems of financial inclusion, both access to credit, where there's socioeconomic gaps and also spatial gaps. And last, we also highlight the problems of vulnerability and again, lack of insurance in view of shocks that destroyed the assets of the poorest families in an unequal manner. So here we pull macroeconomic shocks, health shocks, and again, those shocks that are related to disasters in nature that have a lot of impact on the main assets many families in the region, which is their household. The group of policies, again, this is a menu that covers what has to do with taxes, financial inclusion, policies of household that has not only to do with uh, procurement, but also the ownership and quality and protection against risk. But all of these policies demand the support of citizens in order to make governments finance this type of policies, and that support will mainly depend on the fact that citizens share the idea that social mobility is a problem. So in our CAF survey, we try to understand this item, how are the perceptions of social mobility in the region, and most countries are quite optimistic regarding mobility. This is what we find. They believe that mobility is higher than the one that's actually observed. And this is not homogeneous around the population within each country. There are groups that are more optimistic and others less optimistic. In fact, we find that men are more optimistic, young men are more optimistic, those who reach high educational levels are also more optimistic, and those who are born in wealthy families also. On the contrary, those who manifest more left-wing political um, influence are less optimistic. Many times, these inequalities in the perception on social mobility will complicate the generation of consensus for actions. And some of these differences are due to lack of knowledge on the seriousness of problems on mobility in the region. In our CAF survey, we try to intervene in order to modify that knowledge, reporting certain groups that were randomly assigned about the low mobility in the region. And we found that due to that new information unknown to many, respondents are more willing to support progressive task schemes. They prefer redistribution to be based on talent and effort and merit, and they preferred it to be sooner rather than later, supporting policies that have more to do with human capital formation and less those that have to do with social transfer and social assistance. So to conclude, because time's up, we want to share these comments that said that inequality have deep roots that are explained through these three channels, and it's not trivial to generate consensus that are required for generation of policies. And apart from the fact that consensus is not trivial, there is not a silver bullet against intergenerational persistence of these. So if we summarize our policies section into a cloud of words, we see that there are multiple things here, but all of them have the word opportunity as a dominant factor. So we hope that this report is an ally for all of us as changing agents in order to generate better opportunities and more opportunities for new generations. Thank you.
Les agradecemos a Lucila y Dolores.
Thank you, Lucila and Dolores, for your presentations. And we remind you that you can all share your opinions in social media. And for that, you can use hashtag #RedCAF. And we also invite you to follow at AgendaCAF account on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. And now we are going to move on to the next discussion panel moderated by Adriana Arreaza, Knowledge Manager and Director of Macroeconomic Studies with CAF. She is an economist from the Catholic University Andrés Bello in Caracas, and she holds a PhD in economics from the Brown University. She is professor of economics at the UCAV School of Economics, and she worked at the Department of Research at the Central Bank of Venezuela. The panelists who are going to join Adriana are invited onto the stage.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos. Gracias.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Lucila and Dolores, for your introduction and presentation of the report. I have the privilege to moderate this panel on public policies plus the presentation of the report. And we have a keynote panel. First, Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean of the World Bank. Carlos Felipe has a renowned career at the World Bank with directive offices. He has worked on different positions since 2002, also in Colombia, the Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, and Ministry of Trade. He holds a master's and PhD in economics from the Stanford University. And we have Veronica Marante, professor at the Institute of Economics of Uruguay, OLAR. She is also part of the National System of Researchers, and she's social investigator of Partnership for Economic Policy. She was also director of the ECLAC office in Montevideo. She's interested in development, gender, and labor economy. Next, we have Rodrigo Arin, president of the University of the República in Uruguay. He has been president since 2018, and he works in employment and income distribution. He is also responsible for social policies at the Office of Planning and Budget of the Presidency of the Republic, and she is also international consultant. She conducted PhD studies at the Torquato di Tella University. And finally, we have our manager of gender inclusion and diversity, Ana Maria Baliardi. She was also Minister of Women in Paraguay and Vice Minister at the OAS Women's Commission, and she was also ambassador in Peru and Italy. She also represented her country at the Mercosur and FAO. She published many publications on gender and women violence. She holds a PhD from Perugia University, Complutense University, and the Institute of High Studies. Well, let's start with the first round of questions about some of the concepts related to the general diagnosis that was performed as part of the publication. Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, RED 2022 shows high levels of intergenerational persistence in education, healthcare, occupation, income level, and wealth, as Lucila and Dolores showed. And so this mobility is more pronounced in Latin America and in the Caribbean than other regions of the world. And the report shows three crucial channels to explain this phenomenon. So, Carlos Felipe, what are the main findings of the report, in your opinion, and what would be the main channels of transmitting these inequalities in the region as well? And the natural question that comes to our mind, is there an exception in Latin America, but in a negative way, by which these channels unfortunately operate more strongly in Latin America than in other areas? Thank you, Adriana. Can you hear me? Thank you for your question. How many hours do I have to give my answer? You only have 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So, This will be just the beginning of an answer. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for being with you. It's a pleasure to be here at the CAF, these CAF premises. And I would like to congratulate the presenters before me, Lucila, sorry, and Dolores de la Mata, because they did such a great job. And it's an excellent report, so thank you very much. As I only have 4 minutes to give an answer for the long question that you made, first let me say that my reaction, in addition of having the pleasure of reading the report and finding not just confirmed information that we already knew about the permanence of mobility and the inequalities that exist in the region, much more information relating to this lack of awareness of the social mobility on the part of a large number of people. So, to summarize in one phrase, what the study finds is what the president of CAF said at the very beginning, that unfortunately in our region, and this is possibly the only region in the world where the determining factor for the future of the people is this lottery of the cradle. I mean, what truly determines your future is where you are born, what family you are born in, the income your parents have, your ethnic group, your gender, or your sexual orientation. And this is unfortunately something that is very sad and must be corrected. And I guess that the report is making a great contribution with these cold figures. So my first reaction after reading all this was I felt absolutely frustrated and disappointed. This is not new. This is something that our region has had for long. And when I compare this situation to the situation of other parts of the world, I have the feeling that in most places in the world there are clear policies and institutions. Some of them also are part of the recommendations in order to create and generate social mobility. So you don't find the same mobility persistence in other parts of the world because social consensus has been adopted in order to take action. And as the survey shows, in most countries in Latin America, we still don't have the same actions, the same response. And so this is very worrying indeed. This is the root for social turmoil that we have experienced in many countries in the region. Sometimes we read the news and there are violent episodes, dead people, and we wonder what is the reason? The country seemed to be so quiet. We didn't see it coming. But then when you take a look at this data, these report findings, this is long running, and so your lot is determined by the place where you are born and your ethnic group. And to conclude, Adriana, let me mention two of the channels which I believe are very important. First, education. I believe that without more education mobility, it will be very hard to fight against this. And I am worried that in the two highest levels of the society, they have access to private education and they will be able to compete in the globalized world. However, from that to the bottom, most of the people have access to public education that doesn't provide the same tools. So the education machinery in our region perpetuates inequalities. And it is so sad that this situation probably worsened during the pandemic, according to the information that we see. The figures of the reports show this, and I suspect that In all countries in the region, inequalities have gone up after the pandemic. And the last point, the issue of the excluded groups, those people who do not have more social mobility. This is something that is a problem in most countries in the region. Well, of course, they talked about genders, sexual orientation, disabled people, but I believe that the study very well illustrates the ethnic background. That is to say, those groups or people who come from Afro descendants and those ethnic groups that unfortunately are the groups that move the least in the region, are discriminated when it comes to finding a job, a quality job in particular. And in terms of access to education and stay in education, those who manage to uh, go to school, then when they complete the studies, they are discriminated in the job market. So thank you, Lucila. Thank you, Dolores, for showing us the figures of this hard reality. Thank you, Carlos Felipe. And it is true, this is the lottery of the cradle, as we say. And the report is key, showing not just the inequalities in Latin America, but we know that in the whole world, these exceptions that we see on the report have to do with the fact that education policies were not fully implemented, and some groups were excluded from education, from healthcare, from the labor market. And this is what we see a long time. And with this, I would like to move on to Veronica for the next question. And this is related to the strong connection between intergenerational persistence and inequality. So, Veronica, what do you think is so valuable in analyzing inequalities in this dynamic manner? That is to say, among generations, multiple generations, and what is the main contribution to the social discussion when it comes to analyzing inequalities in that way? Thank you. First of all, this is a report of excellent quality. I would like to congratulate the authors because putting these aspects, trying to connect inequality with mobility is something that is not so common in Latin America. So this is a great contribution. So we've been talking about inequality in Latin America. This is a region that has very high inequality levels, and particularly in relation to the labor market, to the relative demand of workers according to their skills level, and also this perspective of the report, taking us to the origins, taking us to the background of the people is very valuable. First, this look has an important regulatory basis in terms of equal opportunities. And so it makes us think what is fair, what is equitable, what is tolerable, what is not tolerable, and where is the justification. So it is leading us to the idea that individuals should have merits and achievements independent from circumstances. And so their achievements should be connected to effort, to opportunities. That is a very powerful idea from the social justice perspective. So the report in that line makes us think about these aspects. To what extent is it possible to separate achievements from circumstances? Where is a clear line between these things? And we know that parents' aspirations in terms of achievements exists. So there is a direct pass over from parents to children. So thinking about these aspects is one of the fundamental contributions of the report. It makes us think in that perspective. Another point that we should consider is related to understanding the underlying mechanisms. So many questions are triggered from the report. There's a difference between the mechanisms for the upper part of persistence and lower part of persistence. We have the feeling that the mechanisms are different. So sometimes we don't have enough information, but what happens in the region in terms of mechanisms? And this idea that the adverse shocks in the life cycle also has an impact on the next generation. And again, in Latin America, high persistence and low mobility and the economic cycles, the shocks, the economic shocks that we have, that's another avenue of thought. And the third point that was mentioned in the presentation, having this approach and making the low levels of mobility visible is a huge contribution for citizens to be very well informed about these matters, because any policy that we can think of in order to try to change aspects that are so hard require coalitions of supports, and those coalitions can only be built with an informed citizenship. So that's our challenge. What we are discussing now, what we are discussing in the academia, should go more directly to an informed society, aspects that sometimes are not known by people. So these are the three main aspects that I wanted to emphasize. Thank you, Veronica. This information related to the lack of information that people have on these topics is so important in order to create future consensus. And so I see this reality and I want to have more progressive policies in terms of taxes. However, they should concentrate on the initial levels of people's life cycle, such as education, and try to achieve equal opportunities there. So citizens favor those policies. And with this, I would like to move on to the next question for Rodrigo related to education in the region. We believe that the report results suggest that access to education was key in terms of primary education, secondary education, but maybe access was not so deep or marked in higher education. And also schooling processes were not supported by improvements in occupational mobility and the level of income in the region. So how connected are these two problems in the region? First of all, thank you for the invitation to this event, and I join Veronica's opinions about the seriousness of the report that CAF puts on the table. It's very important to have a short, mid, and long-term view in the policy discussion for Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to quote Angus Deaton in The Great Blow of 2015. He said, at the beginning of the 20th century, the main problem in education was between graduates and non-graduates from secondary school. Today, when the education average is higher, that difference is between those who have and those who don't have a university level. So maybe in the simplicity of this quote, we could have the answer as to why there are certain levels of education mobility that do not have a clear reflection on income and mobility. So the report says we have lots of things to do in higher education. However, in the 21st century, as people know, this is the century of knowledge, advanced knowledge, which seems to be the main asset of people to make forward, to progress, sustained in sustainable, environmentally sustainable guidelines. Latin America and the Caribbean is far from this reality, and even though growth has been important in terms of higher education, we are still far from international standards. And I emphasize this because much of the social stratification issues, many of those issues have to do with opening new horizons, expanding chances, and at the same time, as systems expand in education, the education allocation mechanisms towards social roles also require higher education levels. So the report offers good news. However, as tertiary and university education is still limited to small sectors of society, we still have not made progress so that education is a true bridge for social mobility. And I would also like to say that this good news, this idea of primary education in a general way, is related to a region where
pero de forma desigual entre deciles, ¿sí? Entre sectores de ingresos. Y ahí de vuelta tenemos una dificultad. Por último, no toda expansión de los sistemas educativos, en particular terciarios y universitarios, son consistentes con mayor movilidad absoluta y relativa de ingresos ocupacional. Si la forma que América Latina y el Caribe asume esta expansión es reproduciendo estratificaciones y segregaciones, es muy probable que el resultado final no sea mayor movilidad, por lo menos relativa. Y creo que acá hay también otra área de política a atender. Sin duda estamos en la era en donde la educación superior va a seguir creciendo y expandiéndose. Buena parte del tema es si se expande con estándares y características institucionales que lleven a mecanismos de cohesión social y encuentro social, o se expande con mecanismos institucionales en donde las nuevas instituciones y programas están diseñados exclusivamente para los sectores más vulnerables. Ahí creo que hay un área política en donde todavía falta mucho para reflexionar, pero que este informe, al mezclar, conjugar estas tres dimensiones de movilidad, abre la puerta para pensar en el futuro.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Sí, definitivamente.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And that's so good what you say. If this stratification persists, and Veronica said something in that line, we need to understand persistence in the higher education levels and also in the lower education levels. Because if this persists, this additional achievement in terms of a higher education or university education will not necessarily translate into labor achievements. And this leads me to the last question about a dimension that is explored in the report, which is the gender dimension and ethnic groups. According to the report, the social mobility gaps that are suffered by some population groups, women manage to progress in education, but not in employment and income levels. And also in the Afro-descendant groups and indigenous peoples, education mobility has been low, and there is an important lag in the labor market. So, Ana Maria, two questions. What are the barriers for women so that they can have a better labor performance, and what are the main barriers that these racial groups face for their mobility? Thank you, Adriana, and thank you, Lucila and Dolores. This is an excellent report that not only provides figures, but also the interpretation of data and what are the ways and roads that we should follow. As the report said, and according to UNESCO, education parity today exists. We have kinder, we have primary, and the first cycle of secondary. There is equal education. However, in the second half of secondary education and in the tertiary levels, women have different results. So in an equitable world, we should have the same results in the labor market, and this is not so. So higher education or more education does not necessarily imply a better employment level. And this occurs due to different barriers. One is related to the gender roles attributed to the family environment, social environment, establishing opportunities related to the following. So, despite women seem to have better or higher university levels in disciplines such as science, math, engineering, only 34% of women are of graduates are women, and this is related to differences in the income. Another barrier has to do with gender inequalities, early marriage, early pregnancy, adolescent pregnancy, as the report says, and the multiple gender violence forms. That's another barrier that women have. Another point, and for me this seems to be the most important one, has to do with domestic work and non-paid work. And women seem to be also the victims in this. Women spend 3 times as much time as men in order to carry out care activities. And also when women join the formal labor market, there are barriers which in gender literature are related to the sticky floor of women, those barriers that limit the road for women in decision-making positions. We still have these ideas.
In relation to educational mobility in Afro-descendant and indigenous populations, some of the barriers that I've just quoted, all these populations have the same barriers, and we should add also poverty among them. We know that 43% of the population of the indigenous population is poor and 25% of Afro-descendant population is poor. So as was said here before, the cradle determines this. A person born in an Afro-descendant family has in Uruguay 24% less probability of finishing secondary school, and in countries such as Brazil, Ecuador, or Peru, 14 to 16%. We're talking about secondary school. And we take this to the tertiary environment, then we see that half the Afro-descendant populations have less possibilities than other non-Afro-descendant populations. If we talk about indigenous populations, gaps are even higher. So as was said here, cradle determines this. It's not the same thing to be a white, heterosexual, rich man than a Black or indigenous poor woman with disabilities. So I think that our region has great potential to make progress, but we need to be aware that this should be an effort that we should all share. Thank you, Anna. You pointed something quite interesting, despite the fact that women in university achievements is almost the same, but still there are less women participating in science and technology careers that tend to be the most remunerated ones. Then this explains that. But these other factors you mentioned, violence, early pregnancy, among others, are also relevant. And from the point of view of ethnic and racial problems also, we still need an important effort in order to move those groups in terms of greater educational achievement and also income. And also, considering all of this, we move to a second round of questions to focus a bit more on policies promoting equal opportunities. And let me go back here to Carlos Felipe Jaramillo. Among the problems of inequality and poverty that we have in the region, we all know of that are quite part, governments also have a range of political alternatives. Some of them have to do with equity and efficiency problems, and others not so much. Under the perspective proposed by RED 2022, indicating that inequality has a strong inherited component, what would you say are the political improvements in order to achieve greater equality and greater growth so that we don't have that trade-off? And what is the problem in terms of political economy that prevents the implementation of this sort of policies? Because if they were so easy to be implemented, I think we would have already done so. Yes, you're right, Adriana. I would say three things. First of all, I believe that we need to enhance the importance of prompt action in the study and act in a comprehensive and relevant way, for what I was saying at the very beginning, because here it's not just uh, going forward very gradually to get social justice in 100, 200 years. As I was saying, most of the other regions in the world have solved this problem or have a way to generate much more social mobility than here in Latin America. This is the exception to the rule, the exception, the unfortunate exception we have in the region. But also, I'm worried in the short term that this lack of social mobility is, as I was saying, what has led to social unrest, to political and social tension, to mistrust in general terms in most parts of the region, mistrust in democracy and institutions. So I would say that recommendations made by the study need to be enhance, and we should insist on those countries that need an urgent and large effort. Second, let me go back to education. I think this is critical, and I think it's a mistake to think that just because you already have university, primary school, and almost university secondary school, now we're going to focus on tertiary education problems. So I think it's a huge mistake in most parts of the region. Here in Uruguay, it's also different. Why? Because for what I was saying, I feel that most part of the region, we've reached a primary school that's almost universal. But let's see what the first 5, 6 percentiles in distribution learn from the poorest one to the alleged middle class, what they learn in public education. And when I see the results of exams and compare them to what the percentile 1, 2, 3 learns, we are talking about two completely different planets. And this is really unfortunate because I think that this is the strongest proof that our social contract here in Latin America is broken. Those from highest percentile send their children to private schools where they are taught competitive education in global terms, and they don't pay attention to the quality of education of the rest of the population. This is not corrected with tertiary education. This should be fixed with basic education for everyone. Basic quality education so everyone can access that. The education machinery that we have at basic level reproduces through this problem in quality of education, in primary education, the lack of mobility. And I think this is something that is also highlighted here in the study. And I would finish with a third point, which has to do with fiscal policy. Within the recommendations, we need to act in some important matters that require taxes or spending. For instance, inheritance, that I think it was also present in the report, very well present in the report. But let me go beyond something that fiscal policy plays really a very important role in this regard in terms of reducing inequality in many ways, both in terms of taxes as well as in terms of spending, and something that unfortunately continues to be highlighted in all Latin American studies when we see the complete fiscal environment or outlook and we compare it to European countries, the income distribution pre and post fiscal policy in Latin America, the Gini is almost the same. That is to say, fiscal policy in best cases is neutral, when in most developed countries and even in Asian Eastern countries, the corrections to the huge disparities that are accrued are really very strong. Fiscal policy helps in spending and in taxes to equal very much the conditions with which we can enter education and working opportunities. So I think there's a lot to be done in that regard, and I would pay more attention to that conclusion. Thank you, Carlos Felipe. Of course, let me take two things that you mentioned, fiscal policy and also education. In fact, in a report of a couple of years ago, we analyzed the distribution role of fiscal policy. We have the same result in terms of income, pre-tax and transfer. The income distribution does not change much, unlike what happens in European countries, and distribution is mostly achieved through education, health, etc. But the point is that what we are seeing, as you're saying, is that public education is of a different quality than that of private education. And in that sense, in as long as parents of poor households continue to send their children to schools that will give them a lower quality education, those inequalities will continue to reproduce. I think it was Lucila who was the author of this chapter a couple of years ago. And let me also, since we are still talking about education, let me ask Rodrigo. Rodrigo, equal access to a higher quality education and relevant to the demands of the working market, something that you've also commented in your first intervention, continues to be quite an elusive objective. Some countries increase their level of students in higher education with two policies, those facilitating funding and those who talk about the educational supply covering new geographies. However, both strategies have implied important challenges. What are those challenges and how should we face them? Do you think that the educational crisis that derived from the pandemic, where we know that Latin America was the region that had the schools closed for the longest, could it change the way of facing those challenges for expansion to a quality higher education? Well, in fact, these are two questions. I'll try to cover them in 4 minutes. First, funding and geographical coverage are very important ingredients in higher education expansion topics. Let me say that there are some important risks, let me say, that are under process in the region that we should incorporate in the analysis that have to do, for instance, with the territorial development of higher education institutions. For one, the good news and university students in a region, this presupposes to have educational programs that are much more diverse. That is to say, differentiation is an efficient response to the fact that there are more students with different requirements, with different educational formation, and that is reasonable that both institutional platform, and I'm talking about the reemergence of new institutions, as well as the emergencies of new study plans for higher education, for instance, vocational one, also coexist within a political response logic. I think that our higher risk is that this is not only associated to an efficient diversification, but is also associated to a stratification that reproduces inequalities of origin. Here, Latin America and the Caribbean has a serious problem in this regard. In some cases, good part of an increase in the tuition was given in the new higher education, also specialize in sectors that have no prior trajectories, like tertiary level. The most paradigmatic case is Brazil, where you have elite and new very big institutions that provides this sector. So if we think about mobility, this is important. Let me quote something else. Very very recently, Raf Kojis and few authors also published something that calls the attention about the mobility plans in the US, specifically through the use of big data, millions of data linked to social media. High-income sectors generate their economic contacts in universities. Low-income sectors do that in the neighborhoods. And Latin America, with this kind of neighborhoods and segregated universities, this could be something very important. And social perspectives are also frustrated because not always this is the case. Let me try to answer the last questions in two parts. First, COVID luckily allows us to get us together today, but the education effects of COVID, we still don't know what they are. And if those effects are unequal, it's very likely that it continues to obstaculize the different mobilities in the region. Universities, secondary schools will get children and young people that were educated with 2 years with no potentiality. I think we should take that into account because COVID is not over for the educational systems. Second, virtuality would also help us, and we did wonders. All educational systems did wonders with this. Will help us improve the reach of higher education in many cases. But I think that we need to be careful because the first assessments and that are coming indicate that digital platforms were very well used for those students that had a certain degree of autonomy. So, and where you have a greatest loss in terms of formation of education and both in secondary and university education are the most vulnerable sectors. So I'm far from thinking because it's a great temptation from the fiscal point of view. Now I have a great instrument in order to guarantee the access to this education, but I don't think this is sufficient response in terms of mobility because it will change the guidelines in the educational system, but it should be accompanied by some other tools and instruments. Supplies change, maybe less facilities, but more teachers to assist students in a strategy that's still underway. So we do have a tool, but we need to be very careful to think that we have a new panacea in terms of the expansion of the educational system. Rodrigo, definitely virtuality should be seen as a complement and not as a substitute or a mechanism for expansion without considering the limitations that it might bring about, especially in a system as the one you've just mentioned, that expanded without altering that stratification between certain elite universities and some other new universities that have not got much experience. So, Veronica, let me ask you, continuing with this discussion around the three big channels and these policies in terms of reproduction of inequalities placed by the report, in terms of the generation of human capital, new labor, and the accumulation of wealth. Which of these channels do you think are the most relevant? And in which area do you think the region made greatest progress and which one faces the greatest challenges? Okay, the three channels I believe are relevant. It's the question quite difficult. But let me focus, continuing with what we've been saying about education, on the progress made in the region in terms of education that were already mentioned, but the challenges that we now face, I believe that they are very much related to the design of policies. Funding will always be a restriction in these economies. So for sure, there is a challenge there, but the fact of thinking that policies to make education not just be a perpetuation of these persistent mechanisms, the region made great effort in terms of policies such as transfer or grants at tertiary system. So there's kind of a structure there. But I also think that the most important challenge now is from the sectorial area to achieve that integration, something that has not been yet achieved. So in fact, educational policies in the region have a greater challenge than anywhere else. They need to have integration mechanisms. Otherwise, with what is being done in terms of transfer or grants, only with that you cannot achieve that integration, you cannot achieve permanence. We've seen that. There is an example in the region that is extremely valued, the retention of students in secondary school or in tertiary education. Only with transfer mechanisms, this is not achievable. So we need some sectoral policies there that we need to develop. Rodrigo expressed the risk that we have on the one hand in designing these integration mechanisms from educational institutions, but without segregating those offers. And that's both for tertiary education, as was clearly said, but also for secondary education. That is a fundamental challenge in order to see whether we can manage to break up or maybe alleviate this cycle that we are mentioning. There are some other policies and interventions that are also mentioned in the report that have to do or that are less demanding in terms of funding, that have to do with raising practices and information on return to education that aim at changing the behavior of people and are quite being discussed in the academia. I think that they are valuable as complementary devices with a limited scope, and in the short run, structural problems we are talking about really demand more powerful devices and policies than these. And then other two things in another area, which I think that we made the least progress, is wealth. Now, by mentioning this is already important. We know very little about the accumulation of wealth in the region, maybe because there's little information, not because it's non-existent, but because information systems in the countries are not really well organized to make it available to do this. As was mentioned in the previous intervention, the fact of mentioning the the taxation to inheritance in order to know the scope it could have or the effects it could have, and knowing also about the expectations. So already putting it into discussion is important. I consider that fiscal policy more in general can also help a lot in this sense. And of course, there's something that has to do with political economy. Why can't we discuss even further tax to inheritance? We know a lot about VAT, but in terms of these other taxes, we know almost nothing. At least something that has to do with the scope of economies, developing economies, but no further than that. So I think that there's an important area without thinking that the scope that such a tax may have is fundamental in order to change what we've been talking about, but also incorporate it into the pack of policies, tax policies that are being analyzed. Then I also think it's important what the fact that this report also brings new information on educational segregation, also the effect of peers and the access to local public goods. There's a whole area which is the one that's been operating in this regard, which is the main one, and we need to move forward in that. If we think about these policies, it would imply interferences to the composition of neighborhoods, of schools. These are all changes that is difficult to see how they will happen. We are thinking about the possibility that individuals and households that have more resources might be put into a common system to break up with this segregation too. So doing that, also respecting the elections of families, is kind of an important tension in terms of public policy. So I think that when you move forward, you need to think about the system, and there's a wall there that we never imagined in an innovative manner how we could break up with that, because there is a complex political economy that engages us all. But knowing that there is an impulse not there is really something really important.
Thank you, Veronica. And it's true, issues related to political economy are so important. Now we have an idea of the report's diagnosis. Now we have an idea where we can work in terms of policies. And when we talked about taxes, the tax on inheritance, and this thing that you talked about, the geographical areas, these more specific areas, it may be more complex, but that's part of the problem. Now to, well, conclude the panel, gender is part of our discussion. We have the watch here with the time's up indication. So Anna, what are the key components of a comprehensive strategy to promote equal opportunities among women and the most disadvantaged groups? And what are the actions of these strategies in the region? Thank you. First of all, we need to develop data recovery mechanisms. We need to know who we are, where we are, and how we are. These are the gaps that are so important to understand. And then we need to cross or go across all sectors with gender so that gender can be part of all social and economic policies. We need to promote equity alliances in terms of public level, private level, the academia, the civil society, to promote common agendas in favor of these population groups. We also need to have social responsibility policies in the labor sector because this responsibility on women's shoulders today must be distributed not just within the household sector but in society. We need to be zero tolerance for discrimination, gender violence, because we will achieve nothing if 1 out of 3 women suffer from gender violence, not just at home, but on the streets and at work as well. And instead of saying what are the barriers that we face, I would like to talk about challenges. The challenge that we still have in order to implement equality strategies are budgets. 60% of our region has regulatory bodies on gender at ministry levels. According to a study, some of these centers or agencies have few resources to implement actions. So one of the challenges is to gain resources. And another challenge that we have, well, in the regulatory framework, black and white, everybody is equal before the law. Now, how do we get to that? Do we truly have a real and substantive equality? Of course not. And we need to prioritize policies and effective strategies that guarantee everyone's empowerment. Empowerment of women, Afro-descending populations, indigenous populations, in the economic aspect, physical aspect, and decision-making aspect. Thank you. Thank you, Ana Maria. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of this panel. I wanted to conclude, but not in a pessimistic manner. We know that the report shows an overwhelming reality in terms of social mobility, but the awareness of this reality is something that can be positive, important, as Ana Maria said, in order to achieve improved public policies, and as was said before, in order to change this social contract. So in terms of gender, diversity, inclusion, progress has been made, and maybe this is the progress that can permeate other areas in order to talk more about inequality and mobility issues. Thank you, Felipe, Veronica. Well, there were some appointments, but Veronica and Anna Maria as well. Thank you.
Muchas gracias para Adriana.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Carlos Felipe, Rodrigo, who had to leave before. Veronica and Ana Maria, thank you very much for your participation at the panel. Well, we are reaching the end of this first part of the event within the framework of the 176th board meeting of CAF that is held in Montevideo in December 5th and 6th. So we are going to conclude the session. This will have two parts. First, we are going to listen to someone we know very well, Pablo Bartol. He is social development and human manager with CAF. So Pablo, please come onto the stage. Thank you. Thank you, Nicolas. It's a pleasure to um, close this meeting, this presentation, actually, and for the panelists and participants who didn't know Lucila and Dolores before, now they are surprised, of course, and in soccer terms, they are the Lionel Messi and Julian Alvarez players of CAF. That's why the level of this report is really world class. Well, we started today's event with some testimonials. A girl from Bolivia, a girl from Buenos Aires, and a boy from Caracas. And I had the chance to meet Wilkinson this year, and as he said, it was a very tough story that started to change. And today he has his own business, a beverage distributor business. He is very much leading his community. And maybe, well, we could think about this story, these anecdotes, but these cases are exceptions. These are very good cases that we can share, and we try to focus on these stories of people who has been able to come out and progress. But we need now to go into generations. We need to transform generations, and that's a huge leap in terms of investment. So in order to take a huge leap and shift from stories, exceptional stories, people who go beyond expectations, we need to have a massive investment in education. And as we've seen this happen in healthcare because of the need to safeguard life, a similar investment must be made in education. So we need huge investments. Last Friday, by the way, I met with a minister of education of Latin America. And he was telling me that 60% of the toilets in the schools do not have a water closet. So this talks about the huge challenge that we have in many places. And not long ago, we visited the province of Jujuy, and that was the other side of the story. Jujuy province is making a massive investment in education and has connected the investment to an extraordinary inflow that it is getting and the revenues that it has due to the Cauchari plants. So all the revenues coming from the energy of the solar plants are being allocated to the 248 education centers that are being built in Jujuy province. We visited the province with Christian not long ago. We visited 3 schools, and there we see a state presence to transform generations. so that this investment can be massive, generalized, and that it reaches everyone. This is what we need in our countries. So when we think about what to do we invest more in primary education? Because even though we have coverage, we are not so good in quality, or we allocate our funds to university? Well, the answer should be all. But maybe if we think about the education of young people or the training of young people who maybe have not completed school fully, that can be trained for the top quality jobs that are required today, technical jobs that are require training centers. And I think about Ricardo Hausman, former Minister of Planning in Venezuela, and he insists a lot on this know-how, transmitting know-how with these training centers that have these youth training programs. Again, for young people who maybe could not complete a higher education level, but all the same can be trained at a high technical level for what is required at present. And then there is an emblematic sector, which is the software sector. We don't need university people to develop software. Today we have these boot camps that are training thousands of youngsters of our region for this job sector that has high demand and very good income. So again, that's where we should also put our focus when it comes to considering our investment opportunities. And that's where we have also much of our young population. Again, these people who could not complete secondary school, so will not go to university, but have the intellectual skills in order to learn some technological aspects so that they can join the labor market. And finally, what we said before, this issue of the perception that we have as to how bad are we in terms of inequality and what we need for that. And let me summarize this, considering this dilemma between giving fish or teaching how to fish. We don't have to give away fish, but we have to teach people to fish. So part of this effort lies on people, how I perceive myself, how much more do I need to do. And the other part lies on the state to offer equal opportunities. But again, this idea of self-perception, how do we perceive ourselves as a society? This is a challenge that we need to make, a true cultural transformation to become aware of the fact that we are not well. Star Duflo, the Nobel Prize laureate in the fight against poverty, insisted very much on the fact that one of the tools have to do with the uh, promotion of peace, and one of his standard lectures puts the focus on this aspect. So it depends on how I perceive myself and where I want to get and where I will get. If I have a higher aspiration, I will have higher chances of getting far away and making the most of the opportunities. So these are the things that we need to focus on from CAF to support countries in this cultural transformation of people so that they can aspire much more. And so as a society, we will have chances of exceeding these inequalities, and then the massive investment of the state. That's why we are supporting each and every government so that they can truly see. Just as the investment that we made in healthcare, we must also make a massive investment in education. Thank you. Thank you, Pablo, very much for your words. And now we are going to give the floor to Christian Asinelli, the Corporate Vice President for Strategic Programs with CAF, and he's going to close this part of the event. Thank you, Nicolas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Closing this event, which is so important, and doing it from here, from this stage, which is also so imposing, which is our hub in Montevideo City. Valeric is from the Ministry of Finance, and he knows very well the effort that CAF is making in order to have this hub with such a large number of people, men and women, who work to improve the public policies of Latin America and the Caribbean, especially here in Uruguay. And so I imagine that, Carlos Felipe, when you saw these headquarters, you sort of felt envious, right? In Latin America, the World Bank has a huge headquarters in Washington. And well, we have an important headquarters here in Montevideo. By the way, thank you very much for taking this time to share with us this panel and this dialogue that we started as part of the report. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Dolores. Have economists who carried out this important work, and they are going to present it all across Latin America and the Caribbean. We just closed the first presentation chapter of the previous report in Trinidad and Tobago, as we do every year. And there we completed 16 countries, as we said in the previous report, and now these two ladies must do the same thing in Latin America and the Caribbean, in all CAF member countries, so that everybody knows this situation and so that we can trigger a discussion on these important topics. So thank you. And also thank you, Veronica, for your words so that you can give our gratitude to Rodrigo as well. CAF team, the knowledge manager, Adriana and Ernesto, director of research, leading the red report and each and every red report that we make. Secretary General, my dear colleagues, Pablo and Diana, as Sergio said, this report will be very much used by all of you. It will be really very useful for your managerial work. And this report on intergenerational mobility, as we saw on the panels, puts the focus on education, healthcare, and employment. And from the practical perspective, as Pablo said, what are the main sectors that the different CAF teams are working on in order to translate this from knowledge into practice, from the idea into actions? This is what we do from CAF every day. And I'm seeing many ministers, members of the board who are here with us and are part of the board of CAF and will be joining us in many of the activities that we conduct these days. This is also a moment to meet with our colleagues from Latin America and the Caribbean. They not only come to the board meetings, but we also carry out workshops, activities, all situations that at the end of the day improve the quality of the public policy networks of decision makers that we have in the region. I will not repeat the concepts that were discussed at the panels, but just a few conclusions that make us think of this red report as part of a diagnosis, but also as part of the discussion on public policies that should transform into concrete tools for change. good analysis, an excellent report is of no use unless we put it into action. We make a public policy of it. So this is what we want from CAF, create excellent conditions for projects, but also thanks to the work of all the CAF collaborators and colleagues, we help countries overcome the knowledge barrier, overcome problems. And from here, combining knowledge with action, we can finally offer a better quality of life for the citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean. These variables that we include in the report are related to access to healthcare, education, wealth, the material conditions related to our background, our origins, that lead us to a sort of future by default. And this is what we want to change. We want all this information and we want this study and this report, we wanted to help us in our efforts to change this reality that affects Latin America and the Caribbean. And we do have the tools in order to make a change in the future. One of the main contributions that the report has is that it calls us to close the gaps. It offers painful information, it is true, but this painful information should help us implement public policies and tools for change in order to strengthen human capital, in order to improve jobs, promote savings capacities, in order to finally deal with shocks that Latin America suffers often. As Sergio said, within the framework that CAF has, last week we launched in Buenos Aires the report on infrastructure for development in Latin America, the ideal report, focusing on water, energy, and then we had a great dialogue and discussion with one of the public policy decision makers of Argentina, which is ISA, the water administration company. So this is what we did. We combined ourselves and with the investment programs in Argentina, $1 billion invested in water. And that's where we could go together, public policy decision makers, with project builders, with knowledge experts. And clearly, this was a huge contribution from CAF to the service of the region that is related to this new strategic vision of being the Green Bank of Latin America, the bank of recovery and social recovery. Education, as you know, is one of the main problems that we are going to face in the future because the pandemic, among other things, has caused new challenges that we need to overcome.
Esto quizás de alguna manera me lleva
So
a una...
maybe this takes me to one last reflection that has to do with how can we implement these policies also locally. One of the definitions given by our board when we generated the increase in capital, the largest one in the CAF history in the last board meeting, has to do with the fact that we need to work more in those spaces where the decision making is closer to citizens. A week ago, approximately, within the framework of a network that we've been working for more than 1 year that's called Biodiverse Cities, we gather 40 mayors of Latin America and the Caribbean in order to discuss about these matters. A network with over 120 mayors that's working to take all these programs and projects to the smallest states from the territorial point of view that are cities. These are the spaces where the relationship between the decision-making of public policies and where this is thought over is much closer. So facts about equality, access to jobs, and many other matters in terms of social development, gender equality, etc., needs to be the goals to move forward. And this tool of Red 2022 clearly may help us work on that. We need to work in more inclusive and fairer societies, more inclusive societies. That's another request of our board, working towards taking 40% of our operations with environmental content. And that's key in order to make this generational change to give our children and grandchildren a world different from the one that we have. If we don't make any changes, probably it will be worse than the world we got. So that's the challenge of all of us here. So honestly, all Latin Americans, all Caribbeans are somehow waiting from us that have, let's say, a privileged profile, as was shown in the presentation. We need to make a bigger effort because we had the chance, as Sergio was saying, of being born in this golden cradle. We are not rich, but we are privileged vis-a-vis a population that has problems of poverty, marginalization, hunger, and our commitment should be made in order to generate this well-being. This should be much bigger than that to be done by our children. We need to guarantee the fact that they can continue to work, to be educated, access to jobs, etc. I think that the video that was introduced at the very beginning is very good because, as Paulo was saying, even though these may be exceptions, they also show or prove that change is possible, a change we are being part of, each and every one of us, those who are ministers, by making your budgetary decisions and how to handle the economy in your countries, those who are CAF officials, also improving the projects that we have. Because something that was also shown in the video is that talent is somehow distributed homogeneously in society. What's not distributed are opportunities. So what can we do from our role to finding those talents to generate a better distribution, not only of wealth, but also possibilities with projects, programs, and investment that each and every one of you CAF officials make every day. And clearly, the commitment that we all have from now on is to continue working in order to continue to collaborate with governments in the region with that goal of generating more opportunities. So that's all on my part. Thank you very much. Congratulations to all of the Knowledge team for this wonderful presentation of RED. I have one here. I'm taking it home with me. Thank you.
Muy bien, le agradecemos a Cristian
We would
que...
like to thank Christian. He took my RED book. In fact, it was given to me. I left it here and I made that mistake of leaving it here on this podium and I lost it. But anyway, it's a good news because one of the things that we had to tell you is that the report is posted on www.caf.com. But here on your way out, you will also find a printed copy with a great quality so you can take it home, and I hope I can recover mine. So now we'd like to close this first part of the event. Thank you so much, those of you joining us through streaming on our YouTube channel, and thank you all for your presence and attention. Thank you. Have a nice day.